All right, everybody, we're going to finish discussing the fur trade and European exploration of Minnesota. I know we kind of left off where we see locations of the trading posts and where they're at. Flip through here quick. I know we talked Duluth, Gracelawn, or Daniel Gracelawn, Duluth. We talked about Father Louis Hennepin, and he named St. Anthony Falls. And we talked about Pierre Charles Lesueur and his exploration of the Minnesota River Valley. Thinking maybe there was copper down there because of the bluish greenish color of the clay along the riverbanks. Got into this a little bit as the French lose control, even though a lot of the people still working the fur trade are French. The money's going back to Great Britain or going back to London, England, instead of going to France. And the Hudson Bay Company was created, and in Minnesota it was more the Northwest Fur Trading Company did a lot of the work, and they're trying to get, and we'll see this again, but basically everything you see here, all the green and red dots eventually want to send everything up here to Grand Portage, and after the fact that this becomes the United States of America, it goes up here to Fort William, is where it's going to go after this. So there are three types of Europeans trading amongst the Native Americans. The first one we'll talk about was the actual trader. He was the one that set up the trading post. He was the one that would supply the goods that the Native Americans wanted. Now, what type of things did the Native Americans want? They were looking for things made out of metal, knives, hatchets, pots and pans, blankets made out of cloth. They were looking for guns, gunpowder, bullets, anything that was going to make their lives easier is what they wanted. And then what did the traders want? They wanted furs, especially the beaver furs. The beaver furs were going to be worth the most goods, and so that's how the traders were making their money. If they could get more furs and make their goods last. The traders usually came from a wealthy family. They tend to be highly educated. This is an example of what a trading post looked like. This one is recreated down by Pine City, Minnesota, or up by Pine City from here. The Snake River Post is what it was called. You can see it here, or also known as Sayers Post on the Snake River. He worked for, I think, the Northwest Trading Company and maybe the XY Company for a little bit. And you can see the water routes that the voyagers, we'll talk about them in a little bit, would take from here. They'd have to go up the St. Croix River, and then they portage to the Brule River, and then up into Lake Superior. Also usually working at the trading post was the clerk. The clerk worked under the traders, managed the day-to-day operations, tended to be educated but maybe not coming from a wealthy family. Their goal in life was to become a trader. They helped negotiate. They were probably accountants, kept track of what was being taken in and what was going out, how much they had left. And then lastly, the third group were the voyagers. The voyagers were kind of the semi-drivers of the 15, 16, 1700s, I guess maybe more 16, 1700s, early 1800s. Voyager means travels in French. And so if they were the semi-drivers, the canoes were the semis, the rivers and lakes were the roads. And they were the ones responsible for getting the manufactured goods to the trading post. And then in the spring, they were the ones responsible for getting the furs back to the rendezvous post where the other voyagers would come and pick them up. And so they traveled by canoe. Now there were two types of voyagers. First, there was the Montreal Brigade. And these were the voyagers that would travel the Great Lakes system and would get to the rendezvous point, wherever it was at. So, the Minnesota one we're talking about is Grand Portage, right up here. This is where they were going. And they'd have to travel amongst the different lakes and rivers to get out there. And they generally traveled in big canoes. And so they would leave in the spring, usually around May 1st, get there, spend a couple months or spend a month in the summer there, a couple months maybe waiting for the different traders and voyagers to get back. And then before fall, they would load up and go back with the furs. So they had a canoe full of manufactured goods on the way there, and they had a canoe full of furs on the way back. Then there were the winters. These were the voyagers that would spend the winter near the trading post. So if here's Grand Portage, in the fall, they would load up their canoes and they would head out to the trading posts with the traders and clerks, and they were the ones carrying the supplies. Then they would spend all winter, sometimes near the trading post, sometimes in Native American villages, where they would then, in the spring, after the snow melted, they would load up all the furs that the trader had accumulated throughout the winter, and they would head back to the rendezvous point. And we'll see this a little bit on a video later, but sometimes when they came to areas where there wasn't a river or lake, they had to pick up the canoes and carry everything, or pick up the furs or the packages full of gear and carry it. Generally, the canoes that they were carrying throughout Minnesota were 25 to 35 feet long and carried 6 to 10 people and could haul about 3,000 pounds of goods. The Montreal Brigade that came across the Great Lakes had really big canoes, 36 to 48 feet long, could carry up to 5,000 pounds, and over 20 people paddling the canoes. So here's Grand Portage, and this for a long time was where the Northwest Trading Company ran their kind of their rendezvous, where the two groups, the winters and traders and clerks, would meet there in the summer, and the Montreal Brigade would come across Lake Superior and meet there. And so this was a very important place for a long time, and they've recreated it on Lake Superior. If you go up there, there's the Grand Portage Trail, that you can walk now and see it. It's about 8.5-mile trail used by Native Americans and voyagers to avoid waterfalls from Lake Superior to Fort Charlotte on the Pigeon River, as they travel the lakes and rivers up there. This actually was a monument in the park in International Falls in Smoky Bear Park, and I must have walked past it a dozen times and never read it. So in late summer, the voyagers and traders left Grand Portage and moved to their trading posts, where they would trade all winter long with the Native Americans. And then in the spring, they'd load up the canoes with the furs and head to Grand Portage. And this was called the Rendezvous, an annual summer meeting of traders, clerks, voyagers, and Indians. It was a time to relax. It was a time to tell stories, catch up with people you haven't seen all year. Basically just kind of a recuperation time from all the hard work. Huge canoes from Montreal arrived at Grand Portage, bringing with them manufactured goods. Furs were packed onto the canoes, and they would make their way back to Montreal and eventually to Europe. So when the French were in charge, those furs made their way back to France. When the British were in charge, they made their way back to Great Britain. Eventually, though, the Americans are going to be in charge of what becomes Minnesota. And this was the guy that started the American Fur Trading Company, or American Trading Company. His name is John Jacob Astor. And he becomes one of the richest Americans of all time. He starts this company in 1808. Well, as time went on and the War of 1812 ends and we kind of have a boundary between the U.S. and British-controlled Canada, the American Fur Trade Company says, hey, we don't want the Canadians on our land, or we don't want the British on our land taking our furs, taking our animals. And so the United States begins to kind of force out the British from what is now today Minnesota. You can see Astor's worth in today's money is about $138 billion. By 1823, the American Fur Company controlled most of the fur trade across present-day Minnesota. They set up their headquarters in Minnesota in what is now Mendota, right along the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. The trading post was called New Hope, not the town of New Hope that you might know today, but Mendota, what you know today. Henry Hastings Sibley was the man that took over the trading post and ran it for the American Fur Trading Company. So he was paid by the American Fur Trade Company, and he was responsible for trade with the Dakota. He was a young man when he did this. As he got older, you're going to learn he becomes the first governor of our state. One of the guys he was working with is named Alexander Faribault. He ran a trading post along the Cannon River, down by kind of by Faribault and Cannon Falls area, Waterville, between Waterville and Cannon Falls, I believe. The town of Faribault is named after him. His house is still there. You can go and see Alexander Faribault's home that he lived in. Another one of these American Fur Trading Company traders was Henry Rice, who would have been a partner of Sibley. He ran a trading post up north near Grand Rapids called near Lake Pokegama, traded with the Ojibwe. And so all these furs all across the state, all these trading posts that the American Fur Trading Company is running, ends up back in Mendota, where it's then put on the Mississippi River and sent south. If you live in Lonsdale or out that way, you might live in Rice County, which is named after him. He will eventually become a very important politician in our state. Now, oftentimes, traders, clerks, and voyagers would marry Dakota or Ojibwe women, and their children were of mixed heritage, of both European and Native American, and sometimes they didn't really fit into their culture. Neither culture truly accepted them. So what you'll find is the Métis, as they were called, formed their own groups, their own colonies, their own villages. And they were important in the fur trading business because they oftentimes could speak French, they could speak English, and they could speak native languages. The Red River Colony was formed up in northwestern Minnesota up into Canada. Today, it's basically transformed into Winnipeg, Canada, Winnipeg, Manitoba, and they would take carts full of goods, full of beaver pelts, buffalo hides, you name it, everything they traded for. They would take them down from the northwest, up here, Winnipeg, and they would cross all the way down to St. Paul, where they would trade these furs. And you see they kind of follow the rivers a little bit. Red River here, Minnesota River here. And they would take these paths down from up here, and they would trade their furs in St. Paul. And that's going to help St. Paul continue to grow. One of the early reasons that St. Paul grows is because of the fur trade. So they carried down these furs or meat. Pemmican was a type of jerky. And they returned back up there with seeds to plant, maybe wheat seeds, guns, ammunition, tobacco, other things that they needed. And so that was a big operation in the mid 1800s. And so that's just a little bit of the fur trade. We'll continue talking about it as we get more into American exploration in our state and how some of these places grow. And I do have a link to this video in the notes that kind of shows you a good representation of these voyagers and the canoes and the work that they did.